世界嘅香港，大家好。依家咧，我喺加拿大洛基山脈嘅 Calgary。咁就今日咧，同我哋做節目嘅嘉賓咧就係 Professor Paul Rahi。咁佢本身咧就係一位歷史學家，亦都咧係對於喺世界嘅領域，特別係國際之間嘅領域咧係好有研究。咁佢係喺研究所嗰度咧，亦都係Hillsdale College 嗰度咧，就係任教嘅。咁我哋今日咧主要講嘅話題咧，就係咧香港喺共產黨管治之下咧，究竟依家剩翻有幾多嘅一國兩制？咁同埋對台灣有啲咩啟示？咁同埋20大之後咧，香港個未來個前景咧會係點嘅？咁就希望大家咧可以喺留言區嗰度話一話俾我聽，依家嗰個收聽係 O 唔 OK？Professor Rahi, it's a pleasure to have you appearing on Etchin World, a channel that mostly talk about current affairs and investments. Thank you for appearing.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, I was just making a brief introduction of who you are and what we are going to talk about. I was at Hillsdale College just a few days ago in the state of Michigan. I didn't have a chance to meet you then, but we were showing a documentary called The Hong Konger with Mr. Jimmy Lai, the owner of Nix Media. It's a documentary about his life so far. And if you see the ticker below, there are a lot of people, more than 200 of them, that are detained under the enactment of the national security law. And Mr. Jimmy Lai is one of them. One country, two systems was supposed to be to last until 2047, but the whole thing got an abrupt stop with the enactment of the national security law in 2020, in the middle of 2020. From a bird's eye perspective, or from a U.S. perspective, what do you think about the one country, two systems? Is it still intact? To a lot of people, they think it's gone. That's why you see a massive exodus of Hong Kongers leaving Hong Kong in the last 2.5 years. So I just want to get your view of it to start with, and then we'll talk about Taiwan and maybe a little bit about Tibet and Xinjiang as well.
All right. Look, for the most part, it's gone. And leave aside the details of the national security law, it's not clear that there is a rule of law. What there is a rule of the party. And the party has decided that that this arrangement, which was an uneasy arrangement from the very beginning, and of necessity an uneasy arrangement, because each of the systems was a threat to the other. But it's pretty much gone now. And I think that's a disaster, obviously, for the Hong Kongers, for Jimmy Lai, for Cardinal Zen, for many others, but also for the world as well. Hong Kong was an extraordinary place under the British, a place of economic freedom, a place for freedom of discourse. It wasn't a place for self-government, but the arrangements that were made when the One Country, Two Systems Treaty was signed promised at least a modicum of self-government to Hong Kong. That's been made a joke under the new arrangements. And it's a warning to Taiwan about what reunification would mean for Taiwan. But Hong Kong showed just what could be achieved in that little corner of the world. And economically, it was a miracle. And in a certain sense, spiritually, it was a miracle. And much beloved of many of the people who lived there, and of many of the people who continue to live there, as well as, of course, those who have fled. But the other thing is it was a kind of promise. It's important for China because China has nearly always been ruled by an autocracy of one sort or another. None more thoroughgoing than that of Mao Zedong. And there was always the hope that China as a nation would drift in the direction of Hong Kong. And there were some indications of introduction of institutions of self-government at the local level, that was a serious possibility. Since Xi Jinping has taken over, there's been a reversal of that trend, a limitation upon economic freedoms, greater limitations on freedom of religion than had existed under Deng Xiaoping and his immediate successor. And now a crackdown upon economic freedom. So what's happened in Hong Kong is a disaster for the people of Hong Kong, but it is also, as a portent, a disaster for the people of China as a whole. And let me say that it's a disaster for the larger world because it signals a kind of aggressiveness on the part of China with regard to its neighbors that is threatening and extremely dangerous. So what's happened is really a horror. And I regret it very much.
Do you think Taiwan would be attacked by the CCP in the very near future? Especially they have big meeting coming up next week, actually, which would ascertain that President Xi Jinping will go into the third term. Do you think things would change drastically?
They could. I'm not sure. If the Taiwanese were resolute and resistant, it would be very hard to seize the island with an amphibious attack. Between the ports in China and where you would have to land on Taiwan, it's about 100 miles. Much of the year, the weather is not suitable for an invasion during typhoons, for example, or typhoon season. So there's a limited window each year when something like this could be done. If there were fierce resistance, the number of Chinese soldiers who would die en route from the mainland to Taiwan is very great. And the island is one big, gigantic mountain with, flatter coastal areas. It's very hard to get from one part of Taiwan to another without going over bridges or going through tunnels that can be blocked and destroyed. If there was severe resistance on the part of the Taiwanese people, the cost to China would be very great. And it's quite possible that they would be humiliated by a failure to take the island. Where the island is vulnerable is the fact that it imports food and it imports oil. So a blockade at a certain distance from the island, preventing the resupply of the island with oil and food, could grind the island down. And so the question to be asked is, would foreign powers interfere with that blockade? And that's very hard to know. I can only say this: the Japanese have a great deal at stake. Taiwan is near Japanese territory, and it would put Japan within easy range of bombers. Japanese security, to some degree, depends upon the independence of Taiwan. And the United States has a serious interest in it as well. Now, how far that would carry them, what sort of risks they would be willing to take in practice, it's very hard to know. And would the Chinese government, would Xi Jinping, if given a third term, which is everyone expects him to be accorded, would he take those risks? I don't know. He has spoken frequently in such a way as to lead one to suppose that he would take those risks. My own view is you should take what people say seriously. Very few people took Vladimir Putin's threats seriously. They were wrong. Very few people in the 1930s took Adolf Hitler's threats seriously. They were wrong. My own opinion is you err less often if you take the threats issued by the leader of a country with the greatest seriousness.
Especially when President Xi Jinping would ascend to power for the third term, just a confirmation of sorts. So we should take his words seriously then.
Yes. Now, here's another question that one might want to think about. When he reaches the age that Mao reached when Mao died, for very personal reasons, he will have wanted to complete his mission. And central to that mission is the recovery of the lost province of Taiwan. Now, there's a further wrinkle, and it may take us beyond what you want to discuss, but I've been puzzling over it for a while. One of the goals of Xi Jinping and of the Chinese communist regime in general is to overthrow all of the so-called unequal treaties of the past. One of those treaties in the middle of the 19th century took place between Russia and China. And the only country in the world that has claims on Russian territory, Russian national territory, is China. And it's very clear in Chinese strategic doctrines that they sustain that claim. So there may be more down the road. And it's led me for some time now to think that Vladimir Putin is the most foolish leader Russia's ever had, because he's making enemies of the only people who could assist him in resisting Chinese aggression.
Right. We got 2 more minutes. I guess I want to go into a different angle. Now, the war in Ukraine, as most people can see, the Ukrainians, they fight courageously. Of course, that's with the backup from the ammunitions from the free world as well. Now, like, you know, the whole world focuses on Ukraine right now, but as alluded to earlier, Hong Kong is under duress. Hong Kong's glory kind of is finished. So eyes could be on Taiwan within the next 18 months or so. Do you think Russia will back up China if there is an attack on the island?
Golly, that's a hard one to answer, because things are going to change in Russia. They're losing in Ukraine, and they're losing big time. I think Russia will lose Crimea. I think all of those areas of Ukraine that they took in 2014 will return to Ukraine. And I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin will survive that kind of humiliation. There are those in Russia, not in his immediate circle, but beyond his immediate circle, who fear China much more than they fear NATO. And the consequence of this war in Ukraine could be that those people come to power. If they do, they will not back China. If they don't, if Putin remains in power or someone in his entourage takes over from him, then it's quite possible that Russia would back China. And the reason is Russia is turning itself into a satellite of China. Its income is going to come from the export of basic materials, oil and things like that, to China. The relationship with Western Europe is finished. That decision was made when they went into Ukraine. It was a tremendous misjudgment, I believe, but it's now done. So Russia's dependence on China, if Russia remains under the control of Putin or his entourage, has been increased by what's happened in Ukraine. Now, let me say one more final thing. I think Ukraine has implications for China and for Taiwan. It's a warning of the mess you can get yourself into.
Yep.
If you try to take something on. And it's a warning of what the rest of the world might do in response if you were to move against Taiwan. When Russia originally went into Ukraine in 2014, taking some territory along the Russian border and taking Crimea, and the United States and Europe basically did nothing in response, I believe that led Xi Jinping to think that he could get away with militarizing those various reefs out in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And of course, he did get away with that. The opposite may happen on this occasion because of what's going on. The humiliation the Russians are undergoing in Ukraine is not a humiliation that Xi Jinping would want to undergo with regard to Taiwan. So this may have a considerable impact upon Chinese policy. It's very hard for an outsider to guess because this things are held very close to the chest in China. And these conversations take place with a handful of people. They're not public conversations. So I can only guess.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Professor Rahi. And we all wish Hong Kong will be free again. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.